IVF and reproductive rights are all over media, whether it's in the news or on Instagram or YouTube, wherever you're looking. It is fall 2024. We have a big presidential election coming up in the US, and IVF, reproductive rights, and more are front and center. As a reproductive endocrinologist helping people build families with and without IVF for over 20 years, all of a sudden my field is front and center as political debates, as legal formality, and it has just been an incredible process to watch. Lots of emotions. What I want to share with you today is a little bit different from my educational videos that you'll find every week here on YouTube. Be sure and subscribe so you get my weekly videos all about reproductive health. This one is a little bit different. I'm sharing with you a talk that I gave at the Seattle GYN Society on September 20th, 2024 in downtown Seattle. It's a talk about updates for what is going on with reproductive rights in the US right now in fall 2024, and it's reflecting on what's happened in the last 2 years since the overturn of Roe v. Wade. And this talk was prepared to share with my colleagues, obstetricians, gynecologists, reproductive endocrinologists in the Seattle area and surrounding states that are a part of this medical society. And I'm excited to share it with you today. Let's get started. So the title of this talk was When Politics Makes Medical Decisions, the Current State of Reproductive Rights in the US. And again, this was at the Seattle GYN Society, downtown Seattle, given on September 20th, 2024. So I was so grateful for the opportunity to give this talk, and I wanted to share why I was giving this update. For a little context, I started my first job at Pacific Northwest Fertility in 2009, summer 2009. I was so excited about being able to care for patients. I was so excited about learning about everything that was going on in IVF and really starting my own practice straight out of fellowship from Stanford. So here I am, fresh out of fellowship from Stanford, first day on the job, Pacific Northwest Fertility in Seattle. I was so excited about patient care and thinking about IVF and what my future held. The last thing that I was thinking about was politics. I finished medical school in 2002, and I am from a generation that doctors were taught that politics is not polite. You just stay in your lane, you take care of your patients and leave, legal decisions and policies to the politicians, and you just focus on patient care. But I think that led to what happened next. This is a picture of me on June 24th, 2022. Actually, remember this very clearly. This is the day that the Dobbs decision came down from the Supreme Court, overturning Roe v. Wade and taking away the federal protection for abortion rights. And I knew this was coming. It was leaked. I knew it was coming, but it was still such a shock. And here I am recording kind of my reaction to it, because I knew it wasn't just about states taking over abortion rights. I knew it was about so much more: access to IVF, access to contraception, overall maternal health care. And I was prepared. Actually, if you see this reel or TikTok video, you can actually see all these texts coming in at this time from some friends of mine that had a plan. So I had gotten together with 5 other reproductive endocrinologists across the United States to form a nonprofit called Doctors for Fertility in order to educate and advocate for reproductive rights, because we knew what was coming. So here I am standing with Dr. Ruhi Chailani. She is from Illinois, Dr. Natalie Crawford from Texas, Dr. Stephanie Gustin from Nebraska, Dr. Lucky Seacon from New York, and Dr. Serena Chen from New Jersey. And the 6 of us founded this nonprofit, and we have really fought to help with education. So that's how I went from a doctor that stayed in her lane and just sort of didn't really think about politics to, wow, policies and politics are really going to impact how I can take care of my patients. I better pay attention, and I better do something to protect those rights. So when I thought about the current state of reproductive rights in the United States, I put out on my social media, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, I said, hey, if you could describe the current state in one word, what would you describe? And I got over 5,000 answers. I created a word cloud, and words that came back were dangerous, scary, frightening, messy, inequitable, fragile. One of my favorites was from someone, Dr. Karen Tang, who was sitting in the audience when I gave this talk in Seattle. She wrote back on Threads, dumpster fire. 2 words, but it feels fitting. So it was really fun to call out one of my colleagues and someone that I've just really enjoyed getting to know. She has such great educational content as well. And I appreciate her input of dumpster fire. So this is just a little bit of a feeling that a lot of people feel what's going on with reproductive rights today. So the objectives of this talk were multi. I wanted to review exactly what happened with the Dobbs decision and then the fallout over the last 2 years, access to abortion, access to contraception, access to IVF, really kind of go over what happened in Alabama, access to maternal health care in general. And then I wanted to leave you with valuable tips on what you could do next if you want to protect your reproductive rights. So let's go over what happened 2 years ago. What is this Dobbs decision? I think it's important to understand the history. Essentially, this decision eliminated the federal right for abortion. But what does that mean? The question before the court really had to do with a law that was passed in Mississippi. In 2018, the Gestational Age Act passed in Mississippi limited abortion to less than 15 weeks gestation. And the one legal abortion clinic in Mississippi had a doctor who went to the state Supreme Court, and eventually it went to the federal Supreme Court saying this is actually unconstitutional because in 1973, Roe v. Wade passed and said abortion is a federal right as long as it's done up to viability. And viability is around 22 to 24 weeks gestation. And so if Mississippi passed this law saying you couldn't do abortions past 15 weeks, that is against what the federal protection was for abortion between 15 and viability. And so the question before the Supreme Court was, is Mississippi right in passing this law? Paradoxically, the number of abortions overall has actually increased in the last 2 years. In 2022, there were 82,000 abortions per month nationwide. And actually in 2023, there's 86,000 abortions nationwide. There's many thoughts as to why the total number of abortions have increased. Some of it is increased interstate travel and awareness and access, some expansion of telehealth and virtual assistance, increased access to medical abortion and inexpensive pills that can be mailed across state lines. There's lots of reasons to think that this number might have increased, but it's really important to realize that maybe the number has increased or access has increased overall for the United States, but in the states with very strict abortion bans, that is not the case. The number has drastically dropped, and any sort of burden of needing abortion care for someone is drastically increased since the overturn of Roe v. Wade. 7 states have actually voted on abortion measures since Dobbs, and abortion rights have won every time. In California, Vermont, Michigan have all passed state constitutional amendments to protect the right for abortion. Other anti-Dobbs policies that have come into effect in the last 2 years, some laws that were heavily regulating abortion as far as gestational age or who could actually perform the procedures in states like Michigan, Colorado, California, and Minnesota, those have actually all rolled back. New York City has made itself an abortion hub, and a part of its health department is a hotline for information and even some funds to support people in need. And a lot of states have filed shield laws to protect patients coming across state lines for abortion access and to protect the providers, the doctors and nurse practitioners and nurses that are providing abortion care to out-of-state patients. Abortion questions and abortion rights have actually come back to the Supreme Court twice in the last 2 years with victories. I think you could put victories in air quotes. Let me explain. In June 2024, Supreme Court preserves the access to mifepristone. Basically, the question came from a group of providers in Texas saying, We do not think that the FDA was correct in saying that mifepristone was safe to use in medical abortions, and they took it to the Supreme Court to say, we want you to roll back the FDA decisions that Miffy was safe. And the Supreme Court refused to hear the case, meaning that access to mifepristone stays the same, but it's not like they actively did a decision to protect it. In another instance, the Supreme Court made a decision also in June 2024 that allows emergency abortions to be accessed in Idaho. Again, this is not a victory. It's just a decision that allows some medical care to continue. Idaho has one of the strictest abortion bans in the entire United States, to the point where doctors or providers can be criminally prosecuted for providing abortion care unless they can prove that the pregnant person's life was imminently in danger. And this has led to a lot of delay in treatment, a lot of patients being flown out of Idaho for abortion care in nearby states. And just a lot of confusion. So a federal judge in Idaho said this is unacceptable medical care, and it actually goes against MLATA. MLATA is a 1986 decision, an act that said if you are a hospital that accepts federal Medicare funding for your hospital, you have to provide emergency and labor care for people that are coming to you in medical need. And the strict abortion bans were eliminating the ability to provide some stabilizing care. The health department of Idaho took this issue to the Supreme Court to say, we don't think this federal judge is right in saying that we can't strictly ban abortion. And the Supreme Court said, we're not going to hear this case. So not hearing the case means that people can still have access to care, but that did not fix the confusion and some of the delayed care that is still happening in Idaho today. So another fallout from the overturn of Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision is access to contraception. And this came up in the Dobbs decision. Justice Thomas, in his opinion in the Dobbs decision, said we shouldn't only overturn Roe v. Wade, we should also overturn Griswold versus Connecticut. And this was a landmark case from 1965, back when Connecticut was a state that said it was illegal to use contraception, even between married couples. And Griswold was the head of Planned Parenthood of that state. She took this case to the Supreme Court, and they decided, hey, a decision to use contraception or not should really be a private matter that patients should decide with their doctor. It's not up to the state to decide if someone should have access to contraception. So that allowed access to contraception, and it also paved the way for Roe v. Wade, which was passed in 1973. That concept of a medical decision like abortion should be private, and it should be between the patient and the doctor, kind of like access to contraception. So it really is a red flag and a warning that Justice Thomas, in his opinion on overturning Roe v. Wade, also called to overturn Griswold versus Connecticut. Twice there has been a right to contraception act that has come for a vote in Congress. And since this overturn of Roe v. Wade, as a way to protect access to contraception, and twice this has not passed. So this is something that is controversial, and it's something to really pay attention to. There are 14 states that do have laws that protect access to contraception, and 6 of those states and the District of Columbia have actually passed these since the overturn of Roe v. Wade, but that is not every state. There are active bills that are out there trying to limit access to contraception. So far in 2024, 8 states have enacted or attacked contraception access. There's one bill in Oklahoma that proposed as an abortion bill that also included language to limit access to IUD and emergency contraception. And in Alabama, Arizona, and Virginia, all states have tried to pass laws to protect access to contraception. Virginia actually succeeded. Arizona and Alabama did not. But in Virginia, the governor, Glenn Youngkin, actually blocked it. He vetoed it. Again, there are some states that do have laws to protect access of interest. Two of the strictest abortion states actually do have some protection. Tennessee passed a law protecting contraception access for 12 months, and Idaho passed a law protecting access to contraception for 6 months, but only by one vote. So we've talked about fallout for access to abortion, access to contraception. What about IVF? IVF has been in the news so much lately. In early 2024, IVF stopped in the state of Alabama for 3 weeks due to confusion around legal and political decisions. And we'll explain that more in a second. In June 2024, the Southern Baptist Convention actually voted against IVF as morally reprehensible way to build a family. So it's often confusing for people to understand how IVF, which is a family building treatment and it's a way to grow families, what that can have anything to do with abortion, but they are intimately related. So many of the laws that have been enacted or went into automatic effect with the overturn of Roe v. Wade were all about personhood bills, and personhood bills are protecting life at fertilization. So a lot of people who are pro-life are like, all right, we're done fighting for a gestational age act. Forget 15 weeks, forget 6 weeks. Let's protect life when it starts, when an egg and sperm fertilize. We define that as life, and we want to protect embryos and give embryos rights of living children. So these personhood bills are, initially or argued for a way to protect life and to be anti-abortion, but it really impacts treatment with IVF because we're dealing with embryos all the time. We're helping fertilization happen in the lab. We are transferring embryos, we're freezing embryos, we're biopsying embryos. And so if you give rights of a living children to an embryo, there are so many questions that happen. Can you freeze an embryo? What if that embryo doesn't survive the thaw? Is that murder? Can you biopsy an embryo to test for genetic issues and decrease the risk of passing on disease? Is that harming the embryo? So many questions come if you are using personhood bills and personhood language, and that has led to a lot of confusion. So in order to understand this, we have to understand what happened in Alabama, and there's a little bit of history there. In 2018, Alabama amends the state constitution with a sanctity of life clause. This is part of personhood language, and it's part of protecting at fertilization. In December 2020, embryos were destroyed accidentally in a hospital. It's my understanding that the storage area was left unlocked. A patient that has nothing to do with IVF wandered into the storage facility, opened up a cryo tank, took out embryos, and burned their hand, dropped the embryos because it hurt, and those embryos were destroyed. This is absolutely horrible. And 3 couples that were involved with that wanted to sue the hospital and the IVF clinic for wrongful death of a minor. Now, this was rejected by a lower court in Alabama because at that time, people had sued for property damage or neglect or things like that. But suing for wrongful death of a minor is giving rights to the embryo like a child. And we're talking about murder. We're talking about a lot more ability to sue for pain and suffering and damages, etc. And it just has not been done in the United States before. Again, rejected, not able to continue with that lawsuit. 2 years later, with the overturn of Roe v. Wade and the personhood bills that went into automatic effect in Alabama, plus this Alabama Supreme Court constitutional clause with sanctity of life, the couples went back and they said, we want to appeal the 2020 decision, and now we want to sue for wrongful death of a minor. So with these new definitions in effect, the couples from 2020 that had their lawsuit rejected appealed to the Alabama Supreme Court. And on February 16th, 2024, the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that embryos created with IVF and held in cryogenic nurseries, lots of interesting language used in this opinion, are considered children under the Wrongful Death of a Minor Act. And this wreaked havoc in the state of Alabama. About a week later, IVF stopped because people were confused. Doctors said, can we freeze embryos? Can we biopsy embryos? Embryologists said, well, if an embryo doesn't survive the thaw and get ready for an embryo transfer, am I going to be charged with murder? There was so much confusion. And on March 6th, 2024, Governor Kay Ivey does sign a bill to protect IVF providers and clinics from persecution and allows treatments to restart. So if you're just paying attention to the news, you think to yourself, great, IVF is back in Alabama, everything's going to be just fine. But it is absolutely not the same. Several clinics have closed in Alabama. There's still so much confusion. Patients are shipping their embryos and their biology out of the state because they don't feel that protected or safe keeping embryos in the state. And something that's really important to understand is that this law protecting IVF is vulnerable. This law went further than just protecting IVF doctors and providers from being sued for wrongful death of a minor. It actually protected them and gave them complete immunity for any lawsuits that have anything to do with IVF. So it went the complete opposite. You can't sue for neglect or property damage or anything that you were able to do beforehand. It's complete immunity. And there are many people that argue that this actual immunity law is unconstitutional and is very vulnerable and can change at any time. We are on a trajectory that has actually already happened before. So we can learn from history. Let me explain. Law 40 in Italy in 2004 attempted to do what a lot of people are suggesting in the United States today. It was strict IVF restrictions. It allowed only to fertilize 3 eggs at a time. So if you got 10 eggs, you could only fertilize 3. And at that time, egg freezing was not an option. You just had to throw away those other eggs that you got. And you had to transfer any of the fertilized eggs. All embryos were transferred. There was no genetic testing that was allowed, so you weren't able to biopsy and screen for chromosomal issues to decrease the risk of miscarriage. You couldn't check for genetic diseases. There was absolutely no freezing of embryos, and this treatment was only available to hetero married couples only. This was rejected within a few years because of the significant fallout, incredible increased cost to patients and the government. Because if an IVF cycle wasn't successful, you had to go through that whole process again, the shots again, the egg retrieval, and all the risks that could happen with that IVF cycle. The way we practice now, if you have multiple embryos or you freeze some eggs or some embryos, you can use what you have frozen as opposed to having to go through another IVF cycle. And so this is dramatic increase of cost and dramatic increase of risks every time you do any sort of medical procedure. And there were more multiple gestations that were needed. Another fallout is multiple gestations. If you're transferring 3 embryos, there's a chance that 2 could take, and you could have twins. There's a chance that 3 could take. You have triplets. Sometimes embryos split. You could have even more. And these things happened, and we don't have to do that right now. We have such high success rates in IVF. The recommendation from ASRM is truly to transfer a single embryo at a time, and it has dramatically decreased risks with multiple gestations. And without the ability to do genetic testing on embryos, more miscarriages, more genetic disease. And this was a family building treatment option that was denied to anyone that was single or non-hetero and non-married. So we can learn from history. It's not like we don't know what would happen if we are strictly limited in the number of eggs that we can fertilize. So we're on a path that could lead to regulations like this. And what I see in that happening is just increased costs to the patients that are already burdened, increased risks to the patients that are already burdened. And I hope that we can learn from history and not repeat it. I think that the fallout for these things, like access to abortion, access to contraception, access to IVF, is really part of a bigger picture. All of these things, even if you think about them just chipping away at this little thing here or this little decision here, really it is fracturing all of maternal health care. Let me explain. The US has the highest maternal mortality rate of any high-income country. The maternal mortality is twice as high in the overall rate in Black women in the US. And changes in maternal health care that we have witnessed in the last 2 years, from fallout from the overturn of Roe v. Wade has made maternal health care worse. And I want to talk about two specific examples. Number one, maternal health care deserts. What do I mean by this? An example is Idaho. In the state of Idaho, since the overturn of Roe v. Wade and one of the strictest abortion bans in the country with criminalization for providers, et cetera, all that we've talked about today, 3 labor and delivery units have closed across the states. And many OBGYNs and maternal fetal medicine doctors have stopped practicing or left the state. The exact numbers are 22% of OBGYNs have stopped practicing or moved out of state, and 55% of maternal fetal medicine doctors have stopped practicing in the state of Idaho or moved out of the state. So the inability to practice and care for patients has led hospitals to close, maternal health care doctors to leave the state, and this will only result in worse and worse maternal health care. Idaho already is at the bottom 10% of maternal perinatal outcomes for the United States, and I fear this is only going to get worse. Another issue is a lack of physicians coming to states that have strict bans and access issues. 26% of residency applications for obstetrics and gynecology are down in banned states since the overturn of Roe v. Wade. So medical students graduating, they want to learn obstetrics and gynecology. Fewer and fewer of them are applying to banned states. Some examples are applications are down 20% in Tennessee and Alabama. Applications are down 25% in Missouri, and applications are down 26% in the state of Arizona. Since a lot of doctors stay and practice in the states in the area where they do their residency training, I worry about the future of access to care for women in these states where they have fewer and fewer residency applicants. Another big fallout in maternal healthcare since the overturn of Roe v. Wade is with all the confusion and all the misunderstanding about what you can and can't do and when you can and can't do it. There's been such a delay in treatment, and the delay in treatment can have medical consequences. I have 3 examples. Number one, Idaho again, a Boise pharmacist refused to prescribe misoprostol to someone who was prescribed this medication by their obstetrician because they had been diagnosed with miscarriage, and the misoprostol would allow them to pass the pregnancy at home and heal and be able to add to their family like they were planning to. And the pharmacist was afraid to dispense the medication to be seen that that person was dispensing an abortion pill. This is not just about maternal health care. There are articles from around the country where patients who are using medications that could be used in abortion or in medical care for pregnancy are not getting their medication. Arthritis patients are not able to get, or a significant delay in access to methotrexate because methotrexate could be used to treat an ectopic pregnancy. And finally, some really heartbreaking individual stories all around the country, but Texas has several examples. This is Amanda Zorowski. She was 18 weeks pregnant in Texas and had premature rupture of membranes. This is a nidus of infection, and the recommendation 3 years ago would have been to terminate the pregnancy to avoid infection. There's such confusion about what to do because the baby still had a heartbeat, but it was non-viable. And with the confusion and the delay in treatment, Amanda had sepsis, significant infection, and was in the ICU for several days. She has now recovered, but there are serious concerns about her ability to carry a pregnancy in the future. So these confusion, these delays in treatments have lasting consequences for some people. These issues, they go beyond maternal health care. 2 examples: attacks on gender affirming and transgender care. 23 states have enacted restrictions to transgender care, 19 in 2023 and 4 more in 2024. There have been 50 bills proposed in 28 states limiting access to accurate and comprehensive sexual education since the overturn of Roe v. Wade. Deep breath. That was a lot of information. It was a lot of examples, but it's so important to understand exactly what is happening in these decisions, exactly what these headline means. It's more than just sound bites. It's more than news stories. This is maternal health care and other issues having to do with reproductive rights. And it's happening now, and we do have the ability to act to protect reproductive rights. And that's what I want to share with you next. So what can you do? Vote. Vote, vote, not just in the presidential election. Pay attention to state politics, local politics. It's really important. There are 10 states that have bills and measures on the ballot about abortion coming up at the same time as the presidential election. Pay attention to what is going on in your state and what you can do to help. Share your story, share your perspective, especially if you have a fertility journey or you have anything that you feel comfortable sharing. I think that a lot of maternal health care, a lot of IVF, certainly I can speak to, is held in shame and people get nervous about sharing. But I think when you realize that your neighbor, your family member, your friend has been through and needed some of these treatments, it makes it more personal and you get away from the headlines and the sound bites and you say, wow, this is actually really affecting someone that I love. And finally, donate or get active. There are 3 organizations that I support and I recommend. My own organization, of course, Doctors for Fertility. Follow us on social media, become a member, get our newsletter, understand what is going on across the United States and in your own state. Resolve.org, an incredible patient advocacy group. You can donate. They are doing amazing things. They did a lot of work to get IVF going again in Alabama. And then ASRM, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, a wonderful part of their organization is advocacy, and they do a lot of education, and supporting and following these 3 organizations is one incredible way to help. I want to leave you with some more resources. Of course, here on my YouTube channel, lots of educational resources about your reproductive health, a video every week. I really hope that can help you. Another way to learn is my Baby or Bust Fertility podcast, and episodes out every week. I've had specific episodes about reproductive rights. I interviewed Elizabeth Smart. She's the first baby born of IVF in the United States, and she was at the State of the Union this year to represent the importance of maintaining access to IVF. I interviewed Ashley Dunham. She's one of 5 reproductive lawyers in the state of Alabama that counsels patients about fertility law, fertility rights in that state. And she's the only one that did IVF. She has an incredible perspective. And finally, I interviewed Barbara Kalura, the head of Resolve. It was such a wonderful episode. We split it into 2 episodes because we had so much to learn and share, just incredible advocacy work and learning more about what you can do. I hope you learned something from this video. Like this video if you learned something, comment with questions that you have. Be sure and subscribe to this channel so you get my weekly videos all about reproductive health. And until next week, wishing you love, luck, and pineapples.